My name is Daniel Schwammenthal. I am the director of the AJC Transatlantic Institute, the EU office in Brussels of the American Jewish Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this exclusive briefing for lawmakers and diplomats. I have the great pleasure to introduce, first of all, the panelists who will kick off our discussion. Anna Fotyga, former Polish foreign minister and member of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee and Subcommittee on Security and Defense. Congressman Ted Deutch, a senior member of the House Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committees and chair of the Middle East, North Africa and Global Counterterrorism Subcommittee, and Mark Dubowitz, chief executive of FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a Washington-based nonpartisan policy institute. This exclusive meeting is part of the Transatlantic Friends of Israel network we at AJC helped launch in 2019. The Transatlantic Friends of Israel, or TFI, is the first cross-party interparliamentary group of its kind and currently counts over 100 lawmakers from 26 countries united in the conviction that the Jewish state is an integral part of the vital transatlantic security, political, and economic architecture. TFI seeks to strengthen this alliance between Europe, the US, Canada, and the Middle East's only true democracy by fostering dialogue and cooperation among like-minded legislators on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm therefore particularly pleased to see so many new lawmakers here today, and we would, of course, be delighted if you considered also joining our growing network. I have now, though, the pleasure to give the floor to Lukas Mandl, the chair of the Transatlantic Friends of Israel in the European Parliament. Lukas, please.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel Schwammenthal, for the introduction and for launching today's event, which is timely and of major importance. I send my regards today from Vienna, excellencies and dear colleagues from both chambers, as well in Brussels and in Washington, D.C. Iran, the leadership of Iran is one of the biggest threats, not only in the Middle East, not only for Europe, but for the whole planet and for all mankind, I would say. And that's why we have to discuss and we have to act on that threat, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons and to weapons of mass destruction generally, and when it comes to other means of warfare we will face in the future. Also, when it comes to terrorism, when it comes to the proxies of Iran in many different areas. What we will discuss today is the so-called Iran agreement, the JCPOA, and that's a field where we have to underline that all of us in democratic rule of law-based systems in the political West agree that we have to fight this threat coming from the leadership of Iran. So we are not discussing if we face this threat and fight this threat, but we discuss only in some details actually how we fight this threat. And that's why I think it's of enormous importance that we have this exchange today. I thank my colleagues and the experts for their contribution to it, and again, Daniel Schwammenthal and the whole AGC team for launching it and organizing it. I look forward to all the contributions and to the outcomes of today's meeting. All the best, take care, stay healthy, stay safe in these crucial times. All the best from Vienna.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Indeed, we're discussing details and the devil is in the details. Let's now turn to our panelists. Just a quick announcement though, we very much welcome active participation by you lawmakers and diplomats in our meetings. We will set aside at least 20 minutes or 30. So if you would like to make an intervention, please use the chat tool in Zoom or email us at tai@ajc.org so that you can be given the floor. But now to our panelists. Anna, you have initiated a number of resolutions and debates on the Iranian regime, particularly on its violations of human rights at home. Some politicians and analysts tend to compartmentalize Iran's domestic oppression from its foreign policy and nuclear program, arguing these issues must be treated separately. How would you assess this question?
Well, certainly I share this. I share this view. I think that as lawmakers, and earlier when I participated in executive branch of the government, I was traditionally, probably because my background, professional background, is Foreign Office of Polish Solidarność. So I'm very much attached to the notion and concept of protection of human rights. And from this point of view, the situation in Iran and the situation of people of Iran is extremely dire, with the mullah's regime exerting enormous pressure, violence, torture, targeted killings, in particular in recent years, but actually it started a long time ago already. It is my third term in the European Parliament, and very difficult one because of COVID-19 and very limited scope of our activities. At the very beginning, limited to most essential issues. Yet we were lucky to launch also resolutions on Iran, variety of issues. In December 2019, we were able to launch ad hoc resolution on violent crackdown of protests in Iran, and then on a variety of human rights issues. But we also raise hard security issues. We are aware of facts. And as Lukas Mandi mentioned, JCPOA, actually, I must admit, and you know, Daniel, that I was very skeptical at the outset, and knowing the nature of regime, I was very skeptical about goodwill of Iran's regime while engaging in this deal. Now we have the problem to keep, let's say, transatlantic unity vis-a-vis Iran, and we have to do our best, our utmost to find common solution. Honestly speaking, when I look into previous legislature of the European Parliament and so-called famous Hewitt report on Iran, I think that the aftermath of JCPOA was somehow subdued or limited outspokenness of lawmakers about atrocities happening in Iran. We have to eradicate any notion of, let's say, double standards on these issues. We see now still continuity of all bad behaviors we learned about on the side of Iran, being it Yemen or Lebanon or elsewhere, financing of terrorism. It is just a few days ago when we heard about ruling of the Antwerp court. It refers to the incident I was part in to some extent, because I participated in Paris gathering of Iranian diaspora. And I learned later on about attempt to bomb simply this event. Obviously, when we speak about Qasem Soleimani, late Qasem Soleimani's activity and links to professional Iranian diplomacy, this event and this ruling, 25 years in prison, proves the very bad behavior of so-called diplomacy. So we have to stay vigilant. deterioration is visible in previous legislature. We have overall 3 resolutions on Iran, variety of topics. And here, with limited activity of the parliament and not yet half of the term, we've already had 3 resolutions. That means that so many issues arise that even with I would say mainstream, very reluctant to take this issue, the facts are obvious and we have to touch them, and we are able to touch them. So probably that's all. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Anna. You mentioned transatlantic unity. I think it's a good segue to come to our American friends. Ted, with France and Germany suddenly sounding much tough on Iran, calling for an updated nuclear agreement and the inclusion of Israel and Saudi Arabia in the negotiations, the Biden administration may have a unique chance, perhaps, to finally build an internationally and domestically united front. You were among a group of Democrats who voted against the original JCPOA, but you also opposed President Trump's withdrawal, so you may be perhaps ideally positioned to help build bridges here. What is your understanding of how the Biden administration will proceed in the coming weeks?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Daniel. Thanks so much for having me. And it's always great to be with Mark, MEP Fotyga. Good to be with you as well. And MEP Mandl, thanks for your leadership. I just wanted to quickly touch, Daniel, I wanted to follow up on MEP Fotyga's comments, because I think I'll talk about the nuclear, but just very quickly, the one thing that draws, I think, everyone in on Iran are its violations of human rights, the persecution of Baha'i and other religious minorities, the LGBTQ community, the wrongfully detained Europeans, Americans. There are at least 4 Americans. There are upwards of 30 other foreign nationals that have been wrongfully detained by Iran. There is a lot in the human rights area that we all, I think, come together and advocate for. On the nuclear front, you are right. I didn't support the JCPOA in 2015, not because I didn't think that it would place constraints on Iran's nuclear program. I think, all suspected that initially, that at the outset, that it would. But I was concerned about the longevity of the deal, and I was concerned about some of the things that I think could have been included, the things that I know we'll get into more in this conversation here. But as you also point out, I thought that decertifying compliance and withdrawal ultimately left us in a place here without a backup plan to constrain Iran. And you can look at everything that Iran has done since, and we can go into more detail. But as far as where the administration is going, the president has been clear. President Biden's been clear that he supports returning to JCPOA as the best opportunity to get a deal that is stronger than the original JCPOA, that deals with the sunset provisions. It's a longer deal that constrains Iran's nuclear ambitions. I think we all agree. We're all committed to preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons capability. The president's also been clear he's not going to lift sanctions to get Iran back into compliance. And it's clear from the public statements from Iran that there is more that we need to do. The path forward isn't going to be easy here. It's important, as the administration has said and has done thus far, to consult with our European allies. That's why this group and frankly, all of the opportunities in a transatlantic to strengthen the transatlantic relationship will also help as we confront Iran's nuclear ambitions. It's the reason that just this week, the Secretary of Defense will be speaking to NATO. The president's going to be speaking at the Munich Security Conference, in addition to the G7. So bringing all of that, our allies together to work to address the JCPOA leaves just the open question, and Daniel, I'll finish with this. It leaves the open question of whether, as some have suggested, we should simply focus on increasing sanctions and trying to force Iran back into a deal that looks exactly like the deal that we would all like to see, including the administration, one that is stronger and longer as they talk about it, or whether we work together with the United States, our allies, our partners in the region who are impacted most, Israel most especially, to lay out the plan to address the shortfalls, to get Iran back into compliance, to roll back the advances that they've made since we pulled out of the deal. We have the benefit here of hindsight. We know what worked and what didn't work, and we're much further along toward the sunset clauses in the original deal that we were worried about. Those now have to be addressed, and so I'm heartened by the administration's approach to work with our allies to address the things that we know need to be the focus of our attention in Iran, because as to everything Iran does in the region, from missile technology, its malign activity, support of terror, and its human rights violations, obviously Iran with nuclear weapons capability would be much, much harder to confront on all of those other issues as well.
Thank you, Ted, for now. Mark, you have advised successive US administrations and Congress on Iran, and you and your think tank have been specifically influential on devising sanctions. You're a stern critic of the nuclear deal, but you also argued at the time to fix it and not to nix it. Maybe very briefly, because not necessarily everybody here in this meeting may be an Iran expert. What are the main issues, very briefly, that ought to be fixed, and how would you go about
it? Great. Well, Daniel, thanks so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be with old friends like Ted and Anna, and to see all of you. As you said, I was a critic of the deal, but I advocated for fixing it, not nixing it in 2018. And then President Trump obviously decided to withdraw from the deal. But he was right in understanding that the fundamental architecture of the JCPOA is fatally flawed. This, as Ted says, it's a deal that expires over time because of these sunset restrictions. But I would say that the deal is even more fatally flawed than just the sunsets. It's that what we did in 2015 as an international community, but specifically the P5+1, is we abandoned decades of US and international policy, including 5 UN Security Council resolutions that prohibited Iran from having any kind of enrichment or reprocessing on its soil. Now you might say, Daniel, so what? So what if Iran has reprocessing or enrichment on its soil? Of course, the problem is that if Iran has the fundamental nuclear architecture that allows it to develop fissile material, that it will retain that over time. If anything, sorry, I'm losing my voice here so early in the morning. If anything, Iran, when these restrictions go away, can expand to an industrial-sized nuclear program with near-zero nuclear breakout and a easier clandestine sneak out, because Iran from day one gets to work on these very advanced centrifuges, which are more powerful. They're able to enrich uranium at higher speeds. You need fewer numbers of them in order to weaponize uranium, in order to develop a nuclear weapon. And therefore, they're easier to hide. And if they're easier to hide, Iran can put them in smaller enrichment facilities, buried under mountains in clandestine sites, outside of the prying eyes of Western intelligence and the IAEA. So the fundamental mistake we made back in 2013, I would say, with the interim agreement, and then really 2015, was to allow Iran to retain this nuclear infrastructure and have its nuclear infrastructure expand over time. Now, the interesting thing is there are dozens of countries around the world that have civilian nuclear energy, but those countries don't have domestic enrichment or reprocessing. Those countries buy their nuclear fuel from abroad, and those countries truly have peaceful nuclear energy. We unfortunately gave Iran, instead of the gold standard, which is the sort of standard that countries have committed to, like the UAE and South Korea and others, not to develop their own enrichment capability, we gave them the Iran standard. And the Iran standard is, if you're a leading state sponsor of terrorism, if you've killed Americans and Europeans, if you've wrought destruction around the region and around the world, we're going to give you the capabilities to develop fissile material on your soil, unlike dozens of other countries that are peaceful, democratic, and American and European allies. And over time, we're going to allow you to use that fissile material to develop a industrial-sized nuclear infrastructure. And we're going to allow you, even though we're going to try to stop you, from having these advanced centrifuges that could be buried under mountains. So that architecture of the deal was fatally flawed. And I have to say, over the years, I've become increasingly dubious about the proposition that we could actually fix the JCPOA by merely extending the sunsets or having better inspection rights or even adding missile restrictions. Yes, that'll make the deal longer and more durable and perhaps more secure, as Ted suggested, but it's not going to solve the problem, the fundamental problem that the Islamic Republic of Iran will have the capability over time by following the JCPOA, not by violating it, but by following it, to emerge with near zero nuclear breakout and a much easier clandestine sneak out.
Okay, thank you. So obviously we have the fundamental problem that certain capabilities that the Iranian regime will have acquired, it's going to be difficult to make them unlearn them. But let's focus perhaps for a moment on sort of the positive side, as far as I can see it. We had when the agreement was struck, we had agreement between Europe and the United States, but many of our regional allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf states were very concerned. With the withdrawal by the Trump administration, we had Europeans very upset. On the other hand, our regional allies were more pleased. It seems to me, though, that we have perhaps here the greatest possible alignment, that we now have European leaders, primarily the French, the Germans, saying we need an updated agreement. The agreement simply re-entering the nuclear deal will not be enough. Both President Macron and German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas are on the record saying that Israel and Saudi Arabia need to be included in these negotiations. The Biden administration itself says they want an updated agreement. So the question is basically, how do we get there? So there are, I would imagine, Mark, I think you are more of a skeptic about simply re-entering and then trying to negotiate, or perhaps trying first to use the leverage we have now. So where do you think, Ted, how would you, advise the Biden administration to go about it?
Well, I would start by respectfully suggesting that we not limit this to two options alone, that we either negotiate the deal exactly as we all need it to be before agreeing to take any steps, which frankly, given Iran's behavior and the direction that they're headed, puts them closer to a nuclear weapon and all of us at greater risk. But that's one option. Or the other that says we get back into the JCPOA right now exactly as it is, and we'll worry about it later. Those aren't the only two options. And if you look, I think it's critical to your point, Daniel, that there be consultations with the parties who are most impacted by this. And so look at the conversations that have taken place thus far between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Ashkenazi, between Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, and Meir Ben Shabbat, Israel's national security advisor. There were reports that Jake invited his counterpart to participate in a strategic dialogue. I know that they've been engaging on the topic of Iran, so there has to be consultation. Iran's decision to no longer comply with its commitments are going to have to be reversed. We can't just ignore what Iran has been doing, and so I think their decision to pursue 20% enrichment has to be stopped. Iran is enriching uranium at 4.0 to 20%. They're producing 0.5 kilo of uranium per day. They're producing and building new nuclear weapons materials and facilities. All of the activities, as I said, that they're engaged in, threatening to end international inspections altogether if the parties don't return, I think make clear that we have to engage all of us that are in the United States with our European allies, with Israel, with our partners in the Gulf, to figure out how to address the behavior of Iran right now, how to ensure that the JCPOA as it currently exists is not the end product. And there are, I think, maybe lots of ways forward to do that, but they're only going to come if there is ongoing consultation on it. The administration here has been clear that there's got to be a path forward to address the non-nuclear issues as well. I know we've touched on it here, we've all touched on it, but you can't ignore Iran's ongoing support, as Mark rightly points out, as the largest state sponsor of terror. You can't ignore the human rights violations, the missile program. Certainly, the statements from our European partners confirm that. So there is, we're going to, in my subcommittee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, Congress is going to continue to closely consult with the administration. I think that our allies will closely consult with the administration. And I'll close where I started on this one, Daniel. There are not only two options here. And once we acknowledge that the region has changed since 2015, that Iran, that our transatlantic partners' views have changed since 2015, and that Iran's activities compel us to move forward together to roll those activities back. We'll be able to come up, I'm confident, working with the administration with a way to get to a deal that is longer, that is stronger, that addresses the malign activities of Iran. And it would be best for us to be on the same page as we have these conversations, rather than one party trying to drive apart the other. The policy of the last 4 years has been one that we've wanted to come together to find the common strategy going forward. And I think now President Biden is trying to lead the effort to do that.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm just going to jump in right here. I'm Michael Sieveking, the Deputy Director. Daniel's internet somehow crashed. We'll be right there, back in a moment. So thanks for that intervention, Congressman. MEP Fotyga, I wanted to just touch upon what the Congressman just mentioned about the role of the legislature. We know that the European Parliament over the past months and years have been outspoken on the issue of Iran. So perhaps you could talk to us, there's Daniel, talk to us briefly about the EP's role, where you see the legislature coming in on this issue, and where it would position itself going forward.
I must admit that as European Parliament is quite outspoken, there are obvious leaders within the legislature to a variety of initiatives, but majority of the Parliament supports resolutions that are dealing with misbehavior of Iran in the region, or in particular on human rights. With sponsoring of terrorism, it is slightly less, I would say, decisive. It's not so easy. And on JCPOA, I think that majority is for maintaining this. Actually, I was in the clear minority, being skeptical about this. Honestly speaking, I think that it is time for US initiative now, and I hope that series of consultations are to lead to this. And also I must say that I'm skeptical about the path of jumping into the old water and then eventually renegotiating. I think it is time, after consultations, to impose or to move Iran by a variety of tools to next arrangement. I'm not sure what kind of consultations, what's the effect of consultations Borrell had with Minister Lavrov on this. I'm not quite sure that EU as organization maintains the role it had at the outset of it, so 2015. On this, I think that it is time for US initiative on this.
Thank you, Anna. I'm back. Sorry for my Wi-Fi problems. Maybe briefly also to Mark to hear from you on your proposal for how to move forward.
Yeah, no, thanks, Daniel. You know, Congressman Deutch did a very good job of outlining Iran's violations of the JCPOA and how Iran has moved closer to near zero nuclear breakout. But it's worth remembering that every step Iran has taken in the past few months is a step that it is legally permitted to take under the JCPOA after 2023 and 2025. So I just want to remind everybody that Iranian nuclear escalation today is exactly the nuclear escalation we would see under the JCPOA in a few years when the restrictions go away. So, you know, my view is it's better to confront Iran today than it is to confront Iran in 5 to 10 years, because Iran today is a much weaker regime. They've been under maximum pressure. There's been significant economic damage done to the regime. They've lost their most talented and dangerous battlefield commander, Qasem Soleimani. They've lost the head of their nuclear weapons program, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. They have taken repeated hits by the Israelis in Syria with over 2,000 strikes. And it's always interesting. I mean, the Israelis, I think, remind us that the regime is not 10 feet tall, right? Israel is a country of 9 million people with a tiny, but obviously highly effective Air Force and intelligence service. And yet, given the small size of Israel, that its limited ability to project power, it has put Iran on its back heels in ways that are very impressive. It's sort of it does ask the question, you know, if the United States was willing to use all instruments of American power, what would we be capable of doing against this regime? I also want to highlight, because there's been a lot of criticism of the quote unquote maximum pressure campaign, which was really only 2.5 years in the making, from sort of May 2018 to the end of the previous administration's term. It took, as Ted remembers, because he was deeply involved in this, with the backing of Congress, it took Barack Obama about 4 years to get Iran to the table to negotiate the JPOA in 2013, an additional 2 years to then negotiate the JCPOA. So we gave the Obama administration 6 years with full bipartisan support from Congress, who passed the toughest sanctions, sometimes over the objections of the Obama administration, as Ted remembers. But we gave them 6 years to run their Iran policy. And we've sort of now only, you know, after 2.5 years, jumped to the conclusion that pressure against the regime doesn't work. I think that's premature, I think, as Anna pointed out. I also would say, and I think I would use this word carefully, but intentionally, I think it is a delusion to believe that we can negotiate a JCPOA 2.0 when we are going to be giving up the most important leverage that we have. Because people forget that going back into the JCPOA doesn't mean Iran goes back into nuclear compliance. It means that we lift the most powerful economic sanctions as part of a return back to the JCPOA. So now hundreds of billions of dollars are going to be flowing into the coffers of the IRGC, the Quds Force, and the regime. And then we are going to believe, after consultation with our allies, that we are all going to then have the leverage to be able to negotiate a much tougher agreement that today Iran is rejecting, because Iran doesn't want to negotiate a new agreement. They want to go back into the JCPOA because it's a good agreement for them, because they can take patient pathways to nuclear weapons, they can rebuild their economy, they can get resources flowing to their proxies and allies in the Middle East, and they can go back on the offensive, whereas over the past 2.5 years, they very much have been on the defensive. So I too, like Ted and Anna and everybody, hope that there is a JCPOA 2.0, believe that the Biden administration is well-intentioned in wanting to negotiate a new agreement. I am deeply skeptical we're going to negotiate a new agreement when we are giving up the most powerful leverage that we have at the beginning of the negotiations preemptively, just to get Iran back into an agreement that it wants to be in anyway, so that it actually can take these patient pathways to this lethal end state that it will arrive at after 5 years.
Thanks, Mark. Want to encourage again our participants to actively participate if you want. I don't know if Ted wanted to come in. If not, we have some questions from the audience.
I would only, I would just add that I think Mark has ably put his finger on the issue here, which is whether it makes more sense, whether we're in a stronger position to first working with our allies in Europe and the European Parliament, with the administration working with European governments and with the Israelis, whether we're in a stronger position to lay out a plan that actually rolls back what Iran is doing right now, and then gets us to the deal that I think we all acknowledge we need to get to, or whether we decide that there's just no opportunity to do that, and so better to, as Mark says, confront them now than confront them in 2 years or 5 years. I just believe that given the behavior that we've seen from Iran, that we absolutely owe it to ourselves, all of us who do this work, to see if there is a way that actually accomplishes both of those goals, that rolls back Iran's activities now, and instead of waiting to see where they are in 2 years, and addresses the duration of the deal and the sunset provisions, so that we don't have to have this happen now and then we're right back at it in 2 more years. And I don't know I don't know the path forward. I don't know that we get there, but I absolutely believe that the conversations like these that are taking place, the consultations between our government and governments throughout Europe, and certainly with the Israelis, may present that opportunity. And that's, I think, what we have to pursue.
Yeah, Dan, if I could just jump in really quickly, because I just want to make one other comment. We've talked a lot about consultations with our allies. What I find really interesting about 2021, and I think Ted and Anna have both alluded to this, which is it's not 2015 anymore. It's now 6 years later. A lot has changed, is that if you actually listen to our allies that are actually within Iranian missile range, meaning the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis, what they are saying today with one voice is that they're on the same page today publicly in ways that they actually weren't publicly on the same page in 2015. Israel stood alone in opposition to the JCPOA. If you hear them today, what they are saying, and they're saying it clearly and loudly to anybody who will listen, is we oppose a return to the JCPOA. We oppose Iran having fissile material on its own soil. We oppose lifting the most powerful economic sanctions to help Iran rebuild its economy, its military, and its regional presence. And so I think it's important to listen to our allies who actually are in Iranian missile range, who really are facing a life and death struggle against this regime, and to understand that I think they have a pretty clear sense that our return to the JCPOA is not cost-free. We are giving up the most powerful economic sanctions to try, with transatlantic unity, negotiate a new agreement. But in giving up that leverage, I think the open question is, will we have sufficient leverage to negotiate a new, improved, longer, and more durable agreement?
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to give the floor now to David Lega, a TFI member from the European Parliament from Sweden. David.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you to all colleagues taking part in this very important discussion. A lot of the questions I had before have already been answered during this in your own interventions, but I just briefly wanted to comment, since I'm also the shadow rapporteur for Iran for the European Parliament and the EPP group, and we saw a shift a little bit. I just wanted to inform you about this last week when we had a resolution about Yemen, which I negotiated. And I was very surprised during the negotiations that many of the other parties refused to see Iran's role in the proxy war that actually Yemen is. So they refused to put in Iran and mention Iran at all in the resolution, which forced me to put several amendments afterwards to put on the table for all the parliament to vote on. And a bit surprisingly, in the beforehand, they actually won. So we had a huge success compared that the European Parliament now acknowledges that Iran has a part even in Yemen. We mentioned Hezbollah together with Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization. So we made some important progress there. And one of the key reasons that we actually succeeded were networks like this, who played a crucial role in us actually getting all the members to realize that this is important. And in the same way, this network is extremely important for us to work together. So one question is that I do have still is, how do we make sure that the transatlantic link is upheld, given the fact that the US and the EU sometimes tend to have different interests in the region? So let's keep having this discussion and the network alive even after this. And thank you again.
Thanks. Thank you, David. Ted, you want to maybe?
No, I thanks. I want to thank David. I think it's a critically important issue to raise. These sorts of programs, in many ways, AJC and the work that AJC does to strengthen the transatlantic relationship, the Transatlantic Friends of Israel program that you've put together, your work has, I would suggest, has helped to ensure that this important cooperation has continued even during a time in the last administration when I know that many of our friends in Europe questioned America's commitment to that relationship, in large part because some of the things that they were hearing from the president questioning the necessity of that relationship. So I think this has been really important. And then pivoting to where we are now, as I referenced earlier, the fact that virtual though it may be, as everything is these days, the fact that the president is going to speak at the Munich Security Conference. Last time he was there, I was with him several years ago, about the importance of working together, whether it's to combat the pandemic or to confront Iran's nuclear ambitions. David, I agree that we need to work at it. I'm just heartened that now those of us who have been committed to this work, everyone certainly at this meeting, have the benefit of seeing our work sort of bolstered at the highest levels of America's government by an administration that is equally committed to strengthening this vitally important relationship.
My colleagues just pointed out to me that actually tomorrow the UK, France, Germany, and the US will discuss Iran at the foreign minister level. So things are happening. Coming back to what you said, David, and also I know Anna Fotyga worked very hard on putting Iran into the Yemen revolution. I would suggest that maybe the hesitancy to name the Iranian regime was a little bit linked to the negotiations about the JCPOA. There seems to be a certain hesitancy among some politicians to be too serious and tough and honest about Iran's other transgression out of fear it could harm the negotiations about the nuclear deal. And obviously the Iranians are using this and other issues to put pressure. We've seen now various steps to violate the JCPOA. We have seen the attack on American troops in northern Iraq. We have seen the assassination or terror attack attempt in Ethiopia. So what is the best way now for both the US and Europe to react? Giving in to this kind of brinkmanship, and how can we push back without at the same time entering into a military confrontation? Anna.
Thank you. I think that what David Lega told about necessity to maintain, to keep this kind of networking and sharing information. I think that within European Parliament, we are now quite used to use every opportunity, right? Like this example of Yemen. David Lega is right. It was extremely difficult in many earlier attempts, even to mention Iran in the context of Yemen. Actually, success was usually when we were able to dismantle the will to name and shame Iran, name and shame, other actors in this without mentioning Iran. So I think that there is progress, obviously, and we share views over political divisions within the parliament, except of, let's say, very radical political groups. So that is good, but still, I think what is most important is consultations and agreement, common position at the level of governments, because it is still the decisive format to push things forward.
Mark, thank you, Anna. Mark, you said earlier that it's a little bit unfair, perhaps, to say that the maximum pressure campaign has failed, given the fact that it hasn't really been given enough time to play out. Some of the measures were only put in place fairly recently. So how would you then go about this? I mean, there is obviously a risk of escalation. There is a risk of, at the same time, Iran, by continuously violating the current, even insufficient, even if you want to call it an insufficient agreement, you know, moving closer to nuclear threshold. So how would you balance it? Piling on pressure while Iran at the same time advances in many ways to a nuclear weapon or a nuclear threshold state.
Yeah. So Daniel, if I just get one message through on this call, what I'd hope it would be is that, again, Iran gets to escalate its nuclear program inside the JCPOA. All it has to do is be patient, right? So this whole notion that Iran is violating the agreement, is escalating its nuclear program, is using nuclear blackmail, and we're engaged in now nuclear brinkmanship, and that our response to that has got to be go back in the JCPOA, lift the most powerful economic sanctions because we're afraid of Iranian escalation. That may be true, but Iran gets to do all of that anyway by following the JCPOA. So I want that just to be clarified, because if you read the 105-page agreement, it is very, very clear what Iran gets to do over time. And Iran gets to do all of these things within the next few years, starting in 2023. By 2025, it gets to do most of these things. By 2030, it's home free. That's number one. Number two is, I know, Ted and I have been working together. I've had the privilege of being able to work with him for now. Ted, I feel like it's almost 20 years on this issue, if we can believe it. And I think the one thing that I've certainly learned is that Iran tends to escalate in the face of American weakness. It tends to back down when it perceives that America is serious about using instruments of American power. Iran has this game going on right now with the Americans and the Europeans, where it knows that when it engages in nuclear extortion and nuclear blackmail, right, our response is going to be to seek confidence building measures, to return to diplomacy, and to try to get Iran to de-escalate. But of course, Iran understands that the best way to actually get its name removed from resolutions, the best way to get European and American leaders to back down on human rights, on terrorism, on missile proliferation, on regional destruction, is to threaten nuclear escalation. Because then the response is, look, don't upset the Iranians, right, by calling them out on human rights violations or anything else, because their response will be to enrich more uranium or put in more advanced centrifuges at Fordo. So they've got a great game going. And I think the most important response to Iran, at least what I have learned as a student of Iran over the past decades, is that Iran fears American power, and they also fear transatlantic unity. And I think Ted is exactly right, Anna is exactly right. The mistake of the previous administration was to ignore, and in many cases insult, our most important European allies, rather than trying to bring them along and maintain this both transatlantic unity and international unity to isolate Iran as the pariah state that it is. So my response is keep up the pressure, but not only maximum pressure, but maximum diplomacy, but also, again, understand the fundamentally flawed architecture of the JCPOA of patient pathways to nuclear weapons, and the lifting of the most powerful economic sanctions preemptively will make it very, very difficult for us to negotiate the new agreement that all of us seek to achieve.
Daniel, can I jump in?
Please.
May I also?
Okay.
Actually,
Yes.
Actually, on every possible issue, as we live in, I think that we are close to time of strategic simultaneity of many threats, and all of challenging powers, being it Iran, China, or Russia, want first and foremost to dismantle the transatlantic unity, and that we have to put extremely strong. It is we have to use every possible tool to strengthen this unity and will to act together. I'm afraid that our acting should be very decisive, and we have to do it from the position of strength. Otherwise, we are simply neglected as counterpart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Chad, you get the last word.
Well, thanks. In which case, Daniel, thank you again for organizing this. Thanks to you and AJC, and I only wish that we could all be in Brussels together having this conversation in person, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to do it this way and your ongoing efforts to keep us together here. I just want to I guess close by acknowledging Mark's point about pressure and diplomacy. And yes, we want maximum diplomacy. Pressure, it contributes to that maximum diplomacy. And maximum diplomacy, as I've said before, I just want to be clear, doesn't mean that our only options are to accept the deal exactly as it was, or to refuse any deal, or to refuse to even engage because eventually Iran would wind up doing the things that they're doing now in several years. I don't want to be in the position where we're exerting maximum pressure and they're exerting maximum pressure from all the steps that they've done, which is exactly what we were trying to prevent them from doing. Which is why I hope as we all go forward, Europeans and Americans together, that and all of our allies, including Canada, Mark, sorry, that as we have these conversations, we recognize that the goal is to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons capability, that we can continue to stand up to their human rights abuses as we're engaged in that diplomacy, that we have to continue to call out their malign activities in the region, their missile program that puts so many of the countries on this call at greater risk, and that we can do that if we're in consultation and look to create a path forward. I'm suggesting again, we don't know exactly what that looks like, but it is not only we go back to where we were and live with it, or we do nothing until everything is in place, because the Iranians have shown that they're only going to accelerate as well. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation, and for our European friends, as Mark rightly points out, to know how committed the United States is to engaging with them, strengthening the transatlantic relationship, which in this instance of confronting Iran is the single greatest shared threat that we face. from another state actor right now, and I think it's critical that we do this together. And I'm so glad that we have the chance to have this conversation. Look forward to doing it much more often and soon in person.
Thank you so much, Ted. Thank you all. We promised to let you go within an hour, and we are really committed to that promise. So thank you all so much for joining us. Our next Transatlantic Friends of Israel meeting will be about Israel-NATO cooperation, and we will inform you in due course about the details. Again, those of you who have joined us here today and are not yet TFI members, we would be delighted to get, with your help, soon to 200 members. I hope you will join us also for our next program. We are committed to providing this kind of network, for this kind of bridge building, conversations and engagement that is so crucial for our collective security and prosperity. So in the meantime, please stay safe and see you soon. Thank you.